Hi there. One of my viewers recently asked for my opinion on full-frame mirrorless cameras and adapted lenses. And basically that means, what can you do with a Sony A7 series camera? Well, first of all, let's get this full-frame crop factor thing out of the way one more time. I have never been one to advocate the necessity of full frame, but I have also never denied the superiority, technically, of the image quality of full frame sensors. Let's face it, from the beginning of photography, the larger the recording format, the more detailed your images would be. In film, we could have had an 8x10 view camera, which would be totally impractical for street photography, but which would produce the technically best images. So people like Ansel Adams, for instance, would often use a camera similar to that for doing landscape work, because it was a case of setting it up and waiting for the light to be right. At the same time, 35mm film was an ideal format for photojournalism because it allowed for a very small camera. Could you blow the images up as large as you would that 8x10? Of course not. The sweet spot for a lot of people was medium format. Nowadays, with digital, we have many different sizes of sensors, but let's stick to the three most prevalent ones. We have the smallest, micro four thirds. We have the next step up, APS-C. And we have, of course, full frame. Now, I'm not going to get into medium format digital. I'm not going to talk about 1-inch sensors as in the Nikon 1 cameras. No, I'm sticking with those three. Now, what are the pros and cons? Well, first of all, micro four thirds, because of the smaller image circle required for the smaller sensor, it means smaller lenses. So if you are looking for a compact system that you want to be very portable, yet give you very good image quality, then micro four thirds is where you look. Now, what about APS-C? APS-C actually uses two formats, because Canon uses a slightly smaller sensor than what everybody else calls APS-C. Their crop factor, for instance, is 1.6 times rather than 1.5 times. This sensor is larger than micro four thirds, but not tremendously so. And because of that, things like lenses will be a little larger. However, we're still talking about a very compact system. When we get to full frame, then we run into a few snags, because of course full frame mirrorless right now basically means something from Leica or the Sony A7 series. Now, in the case of the Sony A7, the technology used has meant that lenses are still quite large. The lenses for the Alpha series are pretty much on par with the full-frame lenses you would buy for your digital SLR from, Canon or Nikon. So they're quite large lenses, although the camera body itself is very small. Now, there are compact lenses for that system, but generally speaking, there is a bit of a compromise there because of lens size. Now, what are some people doing? Well, some people are getting an M adapter, that is the Leica M mount, putting it on their Sony camera, and then using lenses designed for Leica. Now, when I say designed for Leica, here's what I mean. Actual Leica lenses are very expensive. Unless you actually have a collection of older Leica lenses, you probably aren't going to go out and get an adapter for an A7 to run out and buy these tremendously expensive lenses. However, There are other manufacturers that make and made lenses for the Leica M series. Probably the best known of which is Voigtlander lenses, which were built by Cosina in Japan. They are very high quality. They are much more reasonably priced, and one can put together a very nice set of manual focus lenses using an adapter on your Sony Alpha camera, and everything should work quite well together. Are there any drawbacks? Well, there are a couple. Because of the way in which an image projects onto a sheet of film, and because Leica began as a film system, the short flange distance for a full-frame camera meant that there's a rather steep angle that the light is striking the film at. But with film, that wasn't an issue. However, with a digital sensor, remember, there are little micro lenses over each photosite. Those micro lenses are aligned to work well with the native lenses. Now, when Leica went digital, their micro lenses are specially designed so that at the edges they tend to be shifted slightly toward the center in order to make up for that steep angle. The Sony system apparently doesn't need that, because the lenses designed for Sony do have a little more distance. They actually, even though the flange distance is actually shorter than Leica, the way the lenses are designed, they're designed so that the angle that the light enters is not quite as steep. That means that when you adapt some Leica lenses, especially wide-angle lenses, to these cameras, you may get some nastiness around the edges. Now, what do I mean by nastiness around the edges? Well, what I'm referring to is the fact that you will get a little softness at the edges you would not see if you were using that same lens on a Leica, because of the fact that these micro lenses do cause a little bit of discrepancy, because they aren't at that compressed state, the best way to put it. They aren't moved towards the center a little like the Leicas are. Instead, they're more in line with the photosites. Now, is that a big deal? For most people, no, it won't be. For most people, you are going to put your subject somewhere at or near that center third of your frame. If you're shooting something and you're a devout follower of the rule of thirds, then you're going to have it on that, about that 1/3 line in. So you're away from any softness that might appear there, which would now be in the background and therefore not an issue. Many people who have adapted these lenses to their full-frame Sonys are quite happy with the results. They're not pixel peeping. They're not looking and saying, oh my gosh, look, this is slightly softer than I expected to be up in this upper left corner. No, they're looking at it what I'll call the proper way. They're looking and saying, did I get a nice image? Does this lens give me a good rendering of the image? And if that's the case, then there you have it. Now, as I mentioned, throughout the history of photography, the larger the recording format, the more detailed the images are, simply because there's more real estate on which to record information. So, pixel count is not what I'm talking about. If you had a 12 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, and a 12 megapixel APS-C sensor, and a 12 megapixel full frame sensor, if you were to count the photosites, they would be equal. However, if you were to look at what happens in terms of the depth of field and things like that, that's where things get different. And that's where the larger format has less noise for a given light level, and therefore a more pleasing look. Now, before people jump on this and say, well, noise is not actually a function of the size of the sensor, but instead the image processing, of course, different image processing is going to give you different results. But Take that out of the equation, and for the same light level, a larger sensor will give you larger photo sites, which will be a little more sensitive to the light that strikes them. They will capture a little more. That doesn't mean they're brighter exposure, just means that there is less chance of noise developing. Okay. I don't have a lot to say about this topic because I have no personal experience with full frame sensors, except occasionally borrowing a friend's camera and trying it out. I always liked the results I got. One of the cameras I used was a 12 megapixel D700, and even that gave very, very nice images. The other thing I want to mention has to do with depth of field. The fact is that, of course, the larger format does not mean greater, shallower depth of field. What it means is that to cover the same angle of view, you will be using a longer focal length lens, and therefore will have shallower depth of field. Fact, a 50mm lens has shallower depth of field than a 35mm lens, which has shallower depth of field than a 25mm lens. Now, what does that mean? That means that at f1.7, an f1.7 25mm lens on a micro four thirds camera, an f1.7 35mm lens on an APS-C camera, and an f1.7 50mm lens on a full frame camera will give you a very, very similar field of view, angle of view, I mean. So it will give you very similar images. There will only be slight discrepancies. The actual focal length equivalent, for instance, of a 35mm on a 1.5 crop factor is something like 52.5, so it's a little tiny bit longer appearing. The 25mm on the micro four thirds, remember, micro four thirds, you have a 4:3 ratio rather than a 3:2 ratio, so you are going to get a slightly different view. Now, you set all of those at the same distance and take a picture of the same object, they will give you, as I said, almost exactly the same image view. However, since the 50mm is a longer focal length, it will have shallower depth of field. The 35mm will have a little more in focus, and the 25mm will have even more in focus. So if you are a real bokeh fanatic, you'll need the full frame. This is sort of a roundabout argument. I hope I haven't confused the issue too much. My last word on it is that if you do have a full frame mirrorless camera like a Sony Alpha 7 series, then by all means get yourself an M-mount adapter and go look for some low-cost Leica or Voigtlander lenses. Low cost and Leica usually don't belong in the same sentence, so good luck with that. Well, anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, of course, click like. If you would like to see more of my videos, click subscribe. And if you think anybody's going to get anything from this video, then please share it. Bye for now.